Well, welcome to the podcast. My name is Father Bill W. I'm an Episcopal priest, coming up on 53 years in recovery, if my math is correct. I'm not the best at that. So December 27th is my date of my last drink. I live here in Austin, Texas, and my guest today is Michael T. from the beautiful and sometimes snowy Colorado. He's in long-term 12-step recovery. And I think it's fair to say that he also underwent a second spiritual awakening when he got in touch with the original Pioneer program. It seems to happen to a lot of us. It's like, we're 10 years sober, 15 or such, and we come across this thing and we start working it the way the original pioneers did, and boom, something very different starts happening inside. And Michael was, I think, especially touched by the role of the four absolutes and also by what it means to be doing God's will in the modern world. He's visited with me previously, and I think that's what we're both trying to do. We're not sure where it's leading, but doing God's will takes on a whole new meaning when you get into the Pioneer program, and it's a heck of a lot more than just not drinking or drugging. So welcome, Michael. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you, Father Bill. It's great to be here.
All right. Well, let's begin with your own recovery story. Not looking for a drunkalog, but how did a nice guy like you wind up with a bunch like us?
Well, I wasn't so nice when I was growing up. I think I've always been a seeker. I was adopted when I was a baby, and was raised by adopted parents, just briefly in foster care. But my parents told me at a very young age that I was adopted. Mm-hmm. And I think that played into the narrative that I felt like I just didn't fit in. I didn't feel normal. I felt different. And I was different. I wasn't, the biological son of my parents. So that became a quest for me to find out who am I and my identity. And I think that really led me into, at a young age, a lot of the Jack Kerouac and, kind of rebellious literature and James Dean and sort of the angry young man type of feeling. So when I picked up a drink when I was 15, it really changed the world for me. I was able to talk to people. I was able to give relationship advice, even though I didn't really have any relationship experience. So I became pretty wise, right? And the problem was, of course, that as I continued to drink, I lost control of my life. I mean, I never enjoyed and controlled my drinking. I drank until the beast of the drinking told me to stop. I didn't have control like that. So I had moved out to Los Angeles right after college, and I got in a DUI right before that on my college campus, and could only focus on the fact that it was a campus police officer, not a real police officer, that gave me the DUI and took me into jail. So, very much in denial still at that point. Moved to LA to pursue acting, and I was a theater major, and really became a daily drinker, including stealing alcohol. I got into the wine business, which was great because it was a lot of free alcohol.
I was in the seminary. We were in the wine business too, sort of. I wound up stealing it from the closet there.
Oh yeah. I would fill water bottles with vodka and take them home, and but really got good at romancing the grape, and was a sommelier for a brief time, and in a downtown restaurant. My interest in alcohol was that it changed the way that I felt, and I remember distinctly feeling at one point before I got sober that my plan was to stay drunk until I became famous. That was my best.
A lot of people out there in Los Angeles share that dream. Huh?
And for some it works, but for me it did not. It led down to some, pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization, and eventually, fortunately, I got into Nicotine Anonymous before I got sober, and it was that program that really helped me recover from my nicotine addiction, which was something I'd always wanted to stop almost as soon as I became addicted. So I got exposed to people that were in recovery and that were living different lives, And so it got me curious about, do I have a drinking problem? And at this one meeting I had gone to, they gave out these higher power balls. They were these little bouncy balls. And they called them your higher power ball. And I had gotten drunk one night and lost mine. And I started to kind of get this message that had this awareness that I couldn't control my drinking. And so the night before I went to my first AA meeting, I had this dark night of the soul where I knew that there was nothing that was going to fix me. There was no sugar or drug or alcohol or sex or anything that could fix the way that I was feeling. And that if I took my own physical life, that my spirit would be hanging with that same feeling. And what I was feeling, I guess, and what I identified was that was a spiritual pain, that death, even death, would not allow me to escape from that. So pretty powerful feeling. And so I went to my first AA meeting the next day and identified. I think I wasn't very convinced that I was an alcoholic, even though I took the 20 questions test and did pretty well on that test. It says you're an alcoholic. I wasn't sure. But the more I stayed sober, the more I identified, and it became pretty clear pretty early on that I am for sure someone that has a problem with alcohol. I'm an alcoholic.
Well, how old were you at that time, Michael?
25.
25.
Yeah.
Okay.
I got sober in March of 2001. So I was 25, and then my birthday's in May. So right before I turned 26.
Enmeshment was part of your story, you say, hey?
Yeah. I mean, so enmeshment is really, for me, it's when a parent, in this case, it was my mother, forms basically like a spousal relationship without sex with their child. So I felt the emotional role in the relationship of the household of my mother's partner, and my father was largely absent. I mean, he was there. They were married the whole time, but my mother was bipolar. So she was very up and down all the time. And so I grew up apologizing for things that really were not anything I had responsibility for. And caretaking of her became a priority. And so as a child, I learned early on that my feelings don't really matter, and that it's much more important that I keep my mother happy, to have safety and security in the household, which, did allow me to survive childhood, but later in life did not serve me well, because I had reversed serving other people's needs over my own, which creates resentment and dishonesty and all kinds of things.
Yeah, and you're not alone in that. I share some of that history. My father was missing in action as an active alcoholic, and had two sisters. I was the only boy, and my mother put some of that energy onto me as well. And when I got sober, it's kind of a funny. She did have a good sense of humor, thank God. But when I got sober, they said, now you got to break free from reliance on your mother for money and things like that. So I stopped taking any money from home, and it's like from that day on, it was like earn your own pay. And at about 3 years sober, I get a package in the mail, and I open it up. It's from my mother, and it's a set of apron strings that she had cut and mailed to me. It was symbolic. It was like, okay, you've broken free. I was so proud of. I should have saved them. They should hang over my mantle today. Yeah. But I wasn't aware of it. It takes a long time to become aware of that, but it's more common than people think.
Yeah, and I was aware enough that by the time I was 18 and I'd kind of like moved on and moved out of the house and didn't rely on my parents, I mean, in any real meaningful way. My father helped me out with some credit card debt and early sobriety that I paid him back for eventually, but it was very unhealthy, and I knew that, and nobody else in my life at that time could help me. And they're like, you live in this suburban house, you're fine, your parents, you have two parents, and it was really hard to understand. So I didn't know, it's almost like, what's wrong with me, right? But I did know that there were some basic behaviors that were super toxic, and so I did separate myself. I did eventually reconnect with them, and I got to be with my mother in the hospice care and without resentment, and that was a real miracle of recovery. But it was basically that I hadn't been initiated into manhood, and I got really into this Joseph Campbell, but also Iron John. I don't know if you read that book, but I got my initiation into manhood from other men because my father just wasn't, he's just very detached. I don't think he has the emotional capacity. I don't believe it's out of anything that's mean or spiteful. I just feel like he's not all there when it comes to emotional stuff. So I had to get that elsewhere in my life, but I didn't know that even though after my mother passed, and that was like around 2015, that this enmeshment stuff that I've been set up to do was how I lived all of my relationships. It was my roadmap for relationships. So when I ended up in a relationship with a partner who was doing the same things my mother did, that's what finally woke me up. And that was really, sort of the four horsemen of the apocalypse of that'll kill relationships. So it was defensiveness, criticism, contempt. Well, my partner was doing all of those to me, and I got enraged. And then I realized I really had a problem. There was something deeply, because the amount of rage I felt was not proportionate to what was going on.
Disproportionate, right? Exactly.
Yeah. So I got help, and that's where I got introduced to, Dr. Ken Adams' work when I read Silently Seduced. And then he wrote a second book called When He's Married to Mom. And then he runs these workshops for men, and I did both level 1 and level 2. And it really, really opened me up and helped me understand that I wasn't crazy, that other men have been conditioned this way, and that it does take work to recover from that outside of just the normal work that we do to not pick up substances that are going to kill us.
I just finished a series on men and their emotions. I interviewed 3 guys at the end, and it's like, you do the 12-step recovery thing, but if you're not specifically working on your emotional maturity, it's so easy to miss it,
Yeah.
Funny story, I was in group therapy early in my recovery, and I had a really tough therapist, and he'd going around the group, and he'd pick on you, kind of pull you apart, and then go on to the next guy. Anyway, the fellow right in front of me, he says he was married 9 times. And the therapist looks at him and he says, "Why the hell don't you marry your mother and get it over with?" And sometimes, I see it that men marry their mother. They're totally unconscious, but they're
Yes.
looking for somebody to take care of them
Yes.
emotionally.
That's right.
Or they marry the exact opposite, but they're still doing it.
Or you're the caretaker, as I was. And so
You're the
seeking
caretaker. Well,
other
we do
wounded
doubt
words
that
that I
too.
could take care of. I mean, an example that I heard from one of the leaders of the workshop is, I think, just a really crystal clear example of how this can live on into adulthood. Is a guy was in an enmeshment, one of the workshops, and that night he went out to dinner, and he took his mother out to dinner and left his wife in the hotel. Well,
Oh, we can tell some
so,
stories, can't we?
so it's
Uh,
painful, though. It's a very painful thing. And yes, I think, look, the tools of AA are amazing, but they're not meant to solve every problem. And the book is pretty clear about that. It says we don't argue, we accept outside help, and, we do other things. We're not,
yeah.
we're not meant to be the solution for the rest of your life. And sure, selfishness and self-centeredness are a problem I have as an alcoholic, but really giving my power away is also a huge problem. And that's just not addressed. I mean, not in the initial 12 steps.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
I like to say to people that, like, if there's a 300-pound person standing on my foot, I can say the serenity prayer 1,000 times and write inventories. But until I ask that person to get off of my foot, probably not going to feel any better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially if it's mother.
Yeah, if his mother. And
You got it.
being,
That's
again,
funny.
saying it's me. It's always me. It's my fault. Yes, I am mea culpa all the time, right? Leaves no room to really grow as a person and build self-esteem and say, no, I have a right to have a feeling, and this is how I feel, but incredible how long that's taken me to get there, into the second stage recovery. I mean, I think I was
Absolutely.
19 or 20 years sober. I mean, I'm 23 years now, but yeah. So it was really the pain more, right? It was the acuity of my pain, my emotional pain that drove me
Hmm.
deeper, not just wanting to be more virtuous or, how can I be better? Could,
No,
could,
that's what usually makes us change. It was Richard Rohr's famous line, two things powerful enough to change a person: pain
could
and prayer. And most
yeah,
people choose pain.
yeah, could,
There you go.
very
Speaking
true
of
for me.
change, you changed pretty dramatically in your relationship to recovery, to the 12 steps, to all of that, once you learned about the Pioneer program. How did that come about for you, Michael?
Could, yeah, well, I was in a 12-step study meeting during COVID, and during that, I got very interested in the history of AA and started reading the Oxford group "Remaking the World" by Frank. Is it? You always say it correctly. You
Bookman,
Bookman, thank you, Bookman,
Bookman, yeah.
and getting into other literature. Anne Smith's diaries. Dr. Bob's wife, and so I was getting very interested in what is the history of the program and how did the 12 steps come about. And when I had heard the Oxford group described, in the past, not deeply, but just kind of offhandedly, it's like it was a temperance movement or it was a political thing and it got disbanded. And as I really dug into it, I was like, actually, it really was a spiritual transformational thing that Bookman experienced. And I think it was maybe even something I heard from you on a podcast too. And I got introduced to you in two-way prayer through a woman who was in that 12-step study. It all started to change when, I read that basically Bookman had this experience in Europe where he realized the problem was himself and that these resentments were going to kill him. And, he kind of did a shorthand version of the 12 steps. And the
Exactly.
four absolutes being the early sort of, way to identify what do we want to be? What are we moving towards? What are the virtues, if you will, that should be ideal here? And I found that just so helpful and meaningful. And the idea of a personal relationship, which you talked about in your YouTube that I watched, um, and the two-way prayer just really transformed this whole idea of doing what I'm told to do, kind of like being a good boy, to being a real person and having a real strong connection with God and choosing to do it, choosing to go deeper into it, not being told by a sponsor or somebody else that I need to do this work for myself, choosing, no, I want to do this.
Some people react very negatively to the four absolutes. You responded very positively. Why was that? What's going? Let's dive into that one a little bit deeper. 'Cause I think it's really important.
The reason why I think I found them so useful and was able to not compare and despair or be like, those are just beyond I could never do that or whatever. It was more like, I understand resentment, selfishness, dishonesty, and fear. I understand what I don't want to do. I understand what I'm moving away from. But what am I moving towards?
Exactly.
Where is my destination? What is my divining rod, if you will, through life? And it can't be to just not step in the dog poop, right? Like that's my whole life. It's like, what is the point of my life? Right. And so the four absolutes to me gave me a direction and a way to step into this idea of God's will that became more practical than sort of, theoretical for me. And and then as I understood the four absolutes, and the original intention behind them and Robert Spears, Sermon on the Mount and the character of Jesus in that, for me, it became like, wow, this is kind of like the eternal code for goodness, these four things.
Hmm.
And I don't think you could go wrong trying to do these things. And and again, it was a way for me to start moving into God's will and moving towards something instead of kind of beating myself up for not being more um, more perfect in those other areas.
Of course, the big mistake that people make, and I'd include maybe Wilson among them, he was afraid how alcoholics were going to respond to the four absolutes. Dr. Bob was much more positive towards them. in his last major AA talk. He says, if my actions or my thoughts come pretty close to being honest, pure, unselfish, and loving, they can't be far from God's will for me, So it's
Yes.
that positive element that's so important, and not approaching them from a negative point of view. They're like guardrails, you
Yeah.
know?
Right.
They're like guardrails to my life, to my thoughts, to my actions.
Yeah. I mean, I've had some really cool experiences, like I was on a trip. This is a couple years ago, and it was in Baltimore, and it was early one morning. I went to get groceries, and there was a homeless guy outside of the grocery store talking to himself and moving around real kind of crazy like, and just kind of looked like he was really needed some help, right? Some mental help.
Yeah,
And my very first reaction was, oh, please, I just don't look at me. I don't want to interact with this guy at 7 in the morning.
right.
And right. But then I paused, and that's another thing, kind of learning this, the pause. And I was able to go, which of the four absolutes could I use, in this situation? And I got the idea of love. And so instead of hiding and trying to run, I actually went directly to him, and I
Yes.
looked him in the face, and we actually had a conversation. And he didn't ask me for money. He didn't ask me for anything. He just wanted to talk to somebody. He wanted somebody to look at him. And I was like,
Mm.
oh my God, wow, this is powerful. Yeah.
That's amazing. That's wonderful. Quick story from my end. I was at a church I think it was in Montreal. My wife and I were there, and saw a homeless guy at the front door of the church. And it was the same thing like you're describing. My eyes quickly diverted away from him. I did not want to connect. And so we go through the church and we're looking at all the beautiful things, and we come out the door. Who do I meet? Of course, it's the homeless guy. And he looks at me, and I reach in my pocket and I give him $1 or something. And he looks right in my eyes and he says, "That feels better, doesn't it?" I said, "Yes, it does." I mean, he was on to me. He was on to my dishonesty, on to my fear. We
Yes.
connected at a human level, you know, which it's possible, much more possible than we think it is with people.
Yeah.
We miss it all the time.
I've
Yeah.
got to be connected. I've got to feel that, that conscious contact. And that sometimes is a way to just immediately tap into that. And like I found in, unselfishness at times, like tapping into that, finding it an energy source that is not my own, when I'm too tired to do something. And it's, very miraculous. It really, to be able to step outside of myself and my own sort of like human stuff and be able to tap into something that's so much more powerful than me has really been, to me, the best part of having something to move towards instead of just the good cop, bad cop kind of how well did you do today, Johnny? Well, not very well, like
Yeah.
that just, it was okay. And it still helps in some ways, but after enough of that work and having to do the second level work where it was much more reflective, it was much more about what I told myself about the world and who I am and relationships and how I need love and how I seek love and all that stuff. It just, that technique just didn't work. And like I said, with two-way prayer, I think I just needed stronger medicine, and I needed a way to connect to a higher power that was personal to me. And I had to basically reclaim the Christian ideal for myself and take it away from institutional Christianity and say, you can't tell me what to do. Like, I follow Christ in this way. And I'm not a religious person. I don't go out and evangelize, but this is what works for me. And that really helped that you put that word out there.
You and I kind of followed some of the same paths. Certain point in my recovery, traditional AA just kind of wasn't doing enough for me. And I started to feel that hole in the soul opening up again. And when I did, that's when kind of the universe responded, I would say. And and I met a guy who put me in touch with the Four Absolutes and the early history, and it just totally changed me. Even when I later went and sought ordination, it was like, well, I'm not looking to be a parish priest or something like that. That's not going to work. That's not who I am. I mean, my people are in 12-step recovery, but there's more to 12-step recovery. And when I learned the early history, I got in touch with that. And it's many of the things that you're saying. It's a personal relationship. It's finding God's will for me. The only thing I knew about God's will in the beginning was don't drink. I was pretty clear on that. Now, as crazy as I can be, I was never able to say, well, God's will for me today is go buy a bottle of scotch.
Right.
Couldn't convince myself of that,
Right. Right.
But then what is God's will? What is God? That's an important thing for you, I know. What is God's will for you?
It is, and I think this helped me so much. Was in early recovery when I got sober in LA. I heard in a meeting or somebody, and it stuck with me, people would say, God's will is what's happening. And that used to piss me off because I'm like,
right.
What the hell does that mean? God's will is what's happening. What the hell?
Right.
Until doing more of this work, I realized, no, God's will is what's happening. It's just that I don't understand what's happening most of the time. I'm disconnected. I'm not aware.
And with what's happening, what is my role in what's happening?
That's right.
What am I being asked to do in this?
That's right. That's right.
Do you talk to that guy on the bench?
Right.
Or not?
And that it's a real thing. Again, and I went back and looked at our literature and, the 12-step program. You see that, that one of the things is that we come to rely upon inspiration. I mean, to guide our lives. I mean, inspiration to me comes from God. That's living an inspired life. That is absolutely gigantic. It didn't really hit me until way later in recovery what that meant, that we come to rely on living on a plane of inspiration instead of our own will and our own minds.
And intuition. We will intuitively know.
Right.
So it's aligning the mind with the greater mind.
Yes. It's like connecting to the mainframe, I can overcome any little bugs in my computer system by just connecting to the main server. That's like, unaltered, right? That's pure.
When you do plug into this, and then you do start doing the two-way prayer, you start receiving guidance.
That's right.
You start receiving guidance. They don't talk much about that in 12-step. What's your guidance?
Right.
Dr. Bob said something interesting. He said, I don't need guidance if I'm choosing between right and wrong. I need a conscience. Just need a conscience. But if it's I'm choosing between right and right, then I need guidance. Yeah. Which way is it that you are leading me?
Yes.
Now you've been led. You and I have kind of been in contact for a number of years, and I've kind of watched you change and grow and move in some different directions. But somehow, when God got a hold of you in this intimate way, let's say, somehow that was leading to needing. Let me put it this way: needing to be expressed through art.
Right.
A-R-T.
Right.
You were not an artist, right?
Correct.
But that was the way. Let's talk about art and recovery. How do those two come together in your life?
Yeah. So I think really in the Enmeshment workshop, the first one, and, also in the second one, but there were some assignments where we were to draw things. And I hadn't drawn anything for, I don't know how long. Decades, I had to draw the lost boy, because that's kind of who got formed. Mm-hmm. So I drew the lost boy, and that was really powerful, and it kind of felt good to do that and express that way, but it didn't really dawn on me. And then there was another exercise to draw the protector. Like, let's create this protector that can come out and, set boundaries and protect the inner child, the wounded inner child. So I drew that too. And that became a little bit more elaborate, right? I put that.
Mhm.
But, and I think that was the seeds that had been planted. And along the way, I'd uncovered this truth from my childhood that was painful. When I was young, I had come home with a drawing or painting or whatever, and my mom had, put me down, and which was her sense of humor, right? Was to do that. And said, I hope you never have to make your living as an artist, when I was like 5 or 6. And I didn't know what
Mm.
that meant, but I knew that it was bad. What she was saying was like,
Yeah,
that's
right.
what you've done is not good. And I didn't know I'd buried that. I didn't know I carried that with me, but I guess I had. Because after that, I started it, and I watched a program called Station 11. And it's a lady who has a regular job and does a graphic novel that becomes like very important in the future, in like a dystopian future. And somehow it just hit me. I want to put all these ideas I'm learning and philosophies and spiritual stuff. I want to put this in the form of a graphic kind of novel, and talk about my recovery, but in this visual, like, drawing way. And I made just one little panel on just with chalk, and I called it the Key of Willingness. And I sent it to a few friends in recovery, and people really responded like, wow, this is great. And one guy's like, I thought this was like an album cover. And so it was encouraging. And so that was really my entrance into it. Was I felt, okay, I want to get this message out. And that was how I created the Shadow Angels, universe. Really, that it all sprang from that first panel.
Most people are probably listening to this as a podcast. A number of months ago, we started putting them onto YouTube as well. So if you're listening and or watching this on YouTube throughout the course of this recording, I've asked my assistant to intersperse some pieces of Michael's art. So if you're seeing that and didn't know what was happening there, now you understand what's going on. That somehow he was trying to express through his art some of the things that were going on with him internally. And I think that's so important. Some people can do it through music, some people can do it through dance, but it's a way of connecting the unconscious part of ourselves that needs expression, okay? That you can give it expression. And part of that happens in two-way prayer, particularly if you're more verbally oriented. I've listened to some people's two-way prayer. It's like high art, the way it comes through. It's almost Shakespearean in some ways. Yours is through art. Some people, it's through music. But if you're connecting and then resonating with it, if you're being true to it or if you're being false. It's quite amazing.
It is. It really is. And that the first thing was the Key of Willingness, right? And it's like that was kind of a parallel, because I was willing, and now I was receiving all these transmissions. And so I got to put into characters and paintings all these different concepts. Like self-reliance became like a sort of like a demon family that I call the Bone Crushers, and that comes from the literature talking about self-reliance being a bone-crushing juggernaut whose final achievement is ruin, right? But these became personifications of this language and this universe, and just this way that I'm understanding my reality, my spiritual reality. And it became just a, kind of an endless stream of consciousness, of creativity.
I want to talk for a few minutes about myth and the importance of myth. People think myth is not real, and therefore they dismiss it. But that's not true. Myth is more than real. And we've lost our connection with myth in the modern world. I mean, many psychologists, psychiatrists, writers, and theologians they're all kind of coming to the same conclusion. We've lost our connection to what one mystic called, I love this expression, the beyond that is within.
Mm.
The beyond that is within. What the big book says, the great reality is within. What does that mean? And what does it feel like to be in conscious connection with that? I mean, to me, that's what I try to be about. I'm trying to be about in making two-way prayer more widely known. And then the second thing God told me, and constantly, I mean, it's always like a little addendum. And don't forget to tell people about the four absolutes. It's like those two things. That's my mission statement.
Yes.
Going back almost 30 years.
Yes. I mean, I think that the artwork has become its own sort of like mythology, if you will, in a way. And it's connected to the spiritual quest to find our inner light, if you will. And I love light and dark. And that's how I got Shadow Angels in that quote I think you had mentioned that I had written on the original cover from a book that I found that was referenced by in the Ann Smith journals. But it was that the men there have no light of themselves. Their light is of God. So I like that idea a lot because it's like we're shadows kind of in a way. We're dark forces, but with this light from God, we can be connected to that. But that the duality is really what is real. And it's not about being, 100% light and the darkness is all gone. It's the contrast between the two and how to
I'm both. I'm both end.
That's right.
I'm both darkness and I am light.
That's right.
And if you just try to be one and not the other, you're going to miss it.
Yes.
And you're going to know it's phony.
That's right. That's right.
But real freedom comes, hey, I'm both. Right. Moment to moment, where am I? Yeah.
Exactly.
I love the expression, God's everything or he's nothing, Well, moment to moment, he's in either place, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. Yeah. I almost think of it like a cellular network. Like if you've ever seen like a map of Verizon or a map of these places, and we can tap into any of these sources, right? At any time, like you say, moment to moment. It's in these decisions that we are either tapping into the four absolutes or we're tapping into their opposites or we're in between,
Right. That's right.
Which I call, they're kind of like the orphans of the universe, right? They have both sets of parents, like brutal honesty, resentment and honesty.
Exactly. Hey, just to go back to myths for a moment, in our next episode, we're going to take a myth that you kind of developed, but it's taking program reality and putting it within a new myth.
Yes.
Okay. And I think the same thing's happening with religious things. The old myth isn't working anymore. And so religion gets tossed out. And I understand that. I tossed it out for 20 years too, until I began to understand that, no, this is metaphor. This is mythical understanding. We're coming up on Christmas. I'm going to lose some listeners at this point, But, was Jesus even born in Bethlehem? Probably not. Did wise men come from the east? Probably not. Did shepherds come? No. That none of that is real in the literal sense, but in the sense of metaphor, in the sense of deeper meaning. What it's trying to say is something very powerful.
Yes.
And when people just dismiss it, well, that's it's not true, and because I did the same thing that you had to do. I had to go back and start studying what was first century Christianity all about. What were they trying to put into words? And I discovered the damnedest thing. That, Caesar's name was Savior of the world, Lord of Lords. And there was a star that came at the creation of Rome. all of these mythological things were how people were trying to record them. One monk said it very nicely. He said, the ancients were wise enough to write in metaphors, and in mythological statements. We were dumb enough to believe them, that they were literal. But that's not, hear me, guys, if you're listening out there. The important thing is, what does that mean to us today? Not did some strange, miraculous thing happen 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago in the case of Israel. Is it happening today in you? That's what's important. That's what's important. And so the myths have to change. I had a kid in treatment many, many years ago, and he was really struggling with the spiritual thing. And he was always getting in trouble, and they sent him to my office. I was the head honcho, I said, I just don't believe this stuff. I said, well, what do you believe? We kind of got down to it. And he said, well, it's more like Star Wars and the Force. Well, there's the modern myth, and that's what you're doing, Michael. You're taking recovery facts and processes and putting them into a modern myth, science fiction. What'd you get? A lot of your work is science fiction-y. It's Marvel comic-y, all right? Where'd those influences come from?
Yeah, some from childhood. I mean, I got the idea of the sin virus, which in my world is an acronym for the 7 interdimensions of nefariousness, where the bad guys come from. I got
Do
the
that
idea.
one again. Go that one slowly. Sin.
Sin is the 7 interdimensions of nefariousness.
There you go.
I got the idea for sin being a virus from an Uber driver who was talking to me, who I thought was maybe a little crazy. At the time, I was a little nervous, but he had described sin as a virus and how there's clones in our world and all this other stuff. But it came back to me, and I was like, sin as a virus. Wow, that makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense that there's this goodness within us, and then we have this virus also. And so that's how that became more of a science fiction-y kind of thing. And I think what you're describing to me is like a strange example, but this really applies, I think, to what you're describing is I would watch a lot of Ancient Aliens. I don't know if you've ever seen those shows, but they go back to ancient society and they look at these like monolithic stones and they look at all these drawings that kind of do look like aliens or astronauts or whatever, but they're the same all over the world, like places where there was no communication between. And so it's kind of interesting. And they talk about, hey, maybe there were higher beings that did come down to help humanity. And this is a lot of the religion got misinterpreted. These were things that happened, but they didn't happen because of a mythical thing. They happened because people didn't understand and they just described it a different way. And it just, I guess what I looked at when I went back and looked at the Bible from that perspective, and I was like, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the message. Whether the message came from out of this world or it was made up by man, or it was Christ that came down in a Holy Ghost form, the message is the same. It doesn't change the purpose. It doesn't change God's will. So I think that's the part that I thought was so exciting about it to me.
And that's where Frank Bookman went. I mean, he started off very Christian, evangelical. But if you track the Oxford Group and Moral Rearmament, Initiatives of Change, Alcoholics Anonymous, all of those things, like, it was heading towards a more universal application of basic spiritual truths that cannot be denied, that are common to all of mankind.
Yes.
Whether you're a Hindu, a Buddhist, a non-believer, doesn't matter. What's the role of honesty in your life? What's the role of unselfishness in your life?
When I thought of the 3 different worlds, in my universe, but, in religion, it's heaven and hell and, whatever the waiting area is, across the river Styx, or I don't know. But in my world, it became unity is the good world, isolation is the bad world. separation from others
Yeah.
and God. That's hell, right? That's the idea of it
Right.
to me. And then where we live is in discord because we have both. But unity is what brings us together. So,
And there's an opportunity for that. There's an opportunity for that moment to moment, isn't there?
That's right.
I mean, God is just a thought away.
That's right.
Peace is just a thought away.
Yeah.
You talk about the hero's journey, and I think if recovery could rediscover that, going to meetings and such isn't the be all and end all. It's the beginning of all, but it's an individual journey that each man and woman is setting out. And it's towards wholeness. It's wholeness. It's getting to what you're talking about, Michael.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think, the first call to adventure, right, is when we get, off of whatever we're on, we get sober.
Right.
But then there's so many more, the steps and then going deeper into those and into our understanding. It's just, it's like continuous, it's kind of, again, like the idea of, I've done the steps, I'm done, or I turned my will and my life over to God this morning. I'm good. I got it for the day, which I've tried.
It lasted 3 seconds. That's what I got to get in touch with. When I got on the highway, it was gone.
That's right. That's right. It's not just designed for living. It's like, it's an approach to living, it's like living moment to moment in this certain way allows me to grow and to, what I hope your hope too is to get closer to whatever God's intention is for me while I'm here. Cause I know it's not anything material of this world. It has nothing to do with any of that. It does have a lot to do with though, how I connect to God and how I connect to other people while I'm here and the message that we share.
Yeah. It's learning to be free.
That's right.
To really be free. And that means to really be yourself. And that means to be simultaneously those two parts that you spoke about, the light and the darkness. They're both within me.
Yeah. I mean, did you ever hear when you got sober, did people say, when you're new, well, write everything down you want, and then in a year, look at it and you'll be amazed. You never heard that?
Yes. Oh, sure.
Maybe that was an LA thing or whatever. Yeah. But it was like, I thought that meant you would write down, I want an Acura and you'd get a Range Rover, or, I thought it was all very, yeah. I want to live Beverly Hills adjacent. No, but I live in Beverly Hills now. Anyway, stuff like that. But really what it's about is I don't even know what's good for me. So the surprising thing about the list is that I'm going to now want things I have in my life that I didn't even know that I wanted or needed. And that's a beautiful thing, right? That's a true surrender to go, I truly don't know what's good for me. I mean, I thought alcohol was good for me. I mean, I'm not powerless over my decisions, but I have to be careful about my preferences.
Absolutely. In our next episode, we're going to take a little booklet that you wrote. It's called The Key of Willingness. We're going to really test our technical abilities next time, because we're going to try to go through it page by page and tell the story in modern myth of some of the things that are happening beneath the surface of everybody who's on a 12-step journey, who's taking this spaceship we call recovery through the universe. And man, we're going to meet some strange characters in that bar in Star Wars. They'll probably look pretty familiar to us, come to think of it. And Michael, you will be our guide for that. But I've gone through it 2 or 3 times. That fellow who was struggling with the program and believed in the force. Well, he was probably more in touch with what the reality of God is than most people who are willing to kill you in the name of Jesus or something, I mean, we've kind of missed the message, And it needs to be reformulated
Yes.
for people. They're starting to do the same thing, I think, with the big book. Some of the language and stuff, it just doesn't fit anymore. I mean, people say, who the hell is John Barleycorn? I've never heard of him, you know? So,
Yes.
but a lot of people are going to get angry about that.
Yes.
If you change my book, I'm going to kill you. I
Yeah.
think you kind of missed the message of the book. But we're
Yes.
pretty good at doing that, aren't we? We are
Oh, yeah.
pretty good at missing the message
Yes.
and hitting people over the head with it as we think it should be.
Yes.
So,
Yes. I made a painting about John Barleycorn just because I thought it was funny and interesting. 'Cause nobody.
well, I think that's what we should do. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
bring it to life and you understand it. You understand what it means, right? Isn't
Yes.
that what the painting did for you?
Yeah, it did. Yeah. Yeah. You
Yeah,
get the sense that if you look at it, you get the sense that it's a negative thing. It's not a friendly good thing.
right.
Right.
Who the hell was John Barleycorn? I mean, it's booze, but
It's
what?
booze, right? I don't know. I mean, isn't that,
No,
I think it's
no.
what they made whiskey out of, maybe barley and corn. I have no idea.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
My guess. Yeah.
Yeah, my ancestors were poor Irishmen. They did it out of potatoes. It wasn't nearly as good, but what are you gonna do? You go with what you got.
What you got? Moonshine or whatever.
There you go. There you go. Well, listen, this has been fun, Michael. Thank you for this. If you guys, if you can go to YouTube, I think it's called Two Way Prayer is the channel. You can tune onto that, or Father Bill W. I'm not sure how all this modern stuff works. I'm back there with John Barleycorn. So, well, Michael's kind of leading the new revolution, so he's a little more hip with that stuff than I am. But take a look at it on YouTube, and you'll see some of the artwork that he's doing. And definitely next week, try to listen to that episode via YouTube, because we're going to go panel by panel and explore the outer edges of the universe. So I was going to end with a quote from Star Wars, but I can't remember it. So there you go. Michael, thank you, thank you for leading us on this journey. It's been really great fun. And if you want to get in touch with Michael, I'm going to put his email address in the show notes, and I'll also that book on enmeshment. Email me that, and I'll put that in the show notes too, for people who want to check that out. So
Yeah.
thank you once again. Look forward to next time. And for you guys, thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful for all you fundamentalists. Forgive me, I'm just a heretic. So what are you going to do? I'm God's heretic. Take care. God's peace. See you next time. Bye-bye.